In the 1930s and 1940s, transmitter modulation had to be controlled manually by turning a knob to keep the program at a certain level without the peaks exceeding 100% modulation, which would cause splatter. So basically the operator had to manually adjust the volume continuously, requiring a full-time engineer. In the 1950s, compressors and limiters were used, which basically had a fast attack, medium decay time, in an attempt to remove the operator necessity of controlling signal levels. So this was an automatic signal level controller. But all it did was ensure that the modulation peaks would not go over 100% on the transmitter. So the average program material was not much louder than when controlled manually, just a little bit, a couple dB. In the late 1950s, Gates introduced the model SA38 and the subsequent SA39B peak limiters. I have one here, and this was the first attempt at microsecond control of peaks so that the modulation would be limited at 100% and the program quickly recover to try to increase the average signal level. The studio, of course, had a stay level, which might be a dual time constant compressor, which was a slow attack, slow decay, just to keep the average signal level at a normal range so that this instrument could take over and operate with its fixed input range and attempt to limit the peaks. It's totally vacuum tubes and it's push-pull balanced, as you can see. You have your input, actually hexodes with multiple grids for controlling an intermediate amplifier, and then the push-pull output, 6V6s, and a portion is rectified by the 6H6 through a time constant switch, which basically had a decay time of between 200 milliseconds to 1 second. It improved the signal level of the transmitter, still limited to 100%, of course, but maybe 3 dB stronger modulation than without the unit. That's the Gates SA39B. This was North America's standard peak limiter in the 1950s. With the advent of transistors, it became possible to do some more complex processing. The first CBS Laboratories peak limiter was the Volumax 400, and it was revolutionary. You had a push-pull audio amplifier, amplifying stage, and a portion of that signal was amplified again, rectified, and the time constants chosen for control of a diode varilosser between the input stages was 2 milliseconds attack and 140 milliseconds decay. So in other words, the decay time was much faster than the previous Gates SA39B, and yet it did not require microsecond attack time, which would basically instantaneously punch a hole in your audio. This was 2 milliseconds, so drums were not affected. Drums would pass right through. This was a syllabic compressor. This is what gives the program its density. And then the output stage goes through a Zener diode clipper, and you can choose the symmetry or asymmetry here. So this allows you to control the peaks in the negative direction so that you cannot overmodulate, and yet you can have high density compression. So they're two independent functions. It's a very fast compressor and then followed by a clipper. No one had thought of this idea before. CBS Laboratories was the first, and this gave a 6 to 8 dB increase in modulation level automatically overnight. Everyone dumped their SA39Bs and bought the Volumax. This was state-of-the-art for many years, from 1967 until 1974. In 1975, CBS released the Volumax 4300, which basically was the same as the 400, same time constant, same Zener diode peak limiting, but they added a polarity sensing device which would actually switch the phase of the signal. So this is how this was operating. And you can deliberately check positive phase or negative phase or automatic, which would change with the syllables of speech programming or music. But normally you would just leave it in one position anyway. The only advantage of leaving it automatic is that some syllables, apparently they advertised the word content. The con would be on this side and the tent would be on this side. So it would actually switch mid-syllable to keep your modulation on the high side. Anyway, CBS was king of processors. In the late 70s and 1980s, the Optimod 9100 came out, and this unit had individual compressors for several frequency bands. And unfortunately, this modified the sound of the music because unlike the Volumax 400 and 4300, this unit would change the bass, the treble, and various mid-range bands all individually compressed, which basically altered the entire spectrum of the music. It became something else, something quite different from the ordinary source material, the original source material. And this spreads the energy of the modulation from low to high frequencies equally, as opposed to this unit where the mid-range is the actual compressed signal and the bass and treble follow along with it. But this basically increased the mid-range 6 to 8 dB. Now if you take the 6 to 8 dB compression here and spread it out into 7 or what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6 or 7 frequency bands, you have now dropped the energy of the mid-band. Now, this is fine for local use, but AM is not supposed to be FM. The whole idea of AM transmission is to have very far-reaching range in fringe areas, in cottage country, from the city, for example, from Toronto up to Georgian Bay. So you don't want to waste power in frequencies that no one can hear in a car radio or a pocket transistor radio, like frequencies below 80 hertz. And that's what this thing is doing. It's pumping in energy in frequency bands it shouldn't be. And the proof is, there's a station, WGTO 910 in Michigan, which is only allowed 35 watts at night. And their main processor is the Optimod. And of course I cannot hear that station in Toronto. And somehow, because of my webpage, the engineer emailed me and said he's got an Audimax 4300, which is the unit over here, which is this unit here. And the 4300, when he put it in line, I could hear the station. It was unbelievable. Then he switched it back, the station disappeared. Both were modulating 125%, positive direction. But the energy spectrum of the Optimod destroyed the range. So I maintain, and I challenge anyone with an AM transmitter, I challenge any processor you have to a Volumax 4300 or Volumax 400. I challenge anyone to find a processor which increases the transmitter range more than these. And this is why I maintain not only are they the first real true audio processor for AM broadcasting, 1967, I maintain that they still are relevant to this day, in this day and age of digital processing. And when you have an emergency like Hurricane Katrina and you need to reach the fringe areas at low power conditions and a poor antenna, or your antenna tower has fallen down, you got to use an auxiliary transmitter, it's low power, you better get that Volumax hooked up. That is the only way you're going to reach your listeners. And now I'm going to show you the audio. Yesterday I showed the audio on a scope, which was just the line output. But when you actually see the modulation, the RF envelope, have a look.
Giving love so warm, reflecting the dark truth of reality. The very step we take, the living breath we live, dying, just you and me.
can see the density of that modulated RF waveform is incredibly dense. You couldn't get any more modulation in there. It's almost like a square wave. It's almost like continuous 125% power output. And yet there's no distortion in the music or voice. It's incredible. And the interesting thing about the Volumax, as far as their specification is concerned, it says that the result is an even, pleasant sound. Not like the Optimod. It does not have a pleasant sound to certain rock music. It just doesn't sound right because it's altered it. The result is an even, pleasant sound and the capability of transmitting program signals with a high peak factor at twice the average program power level usually expected when conventional limiters are used. In other words, the best limiters in 1974, this was twice as loud as those. So if you can appreciate that, that's, well, it's mind-boggling actually. And there you go, the history of North American AM radio processing.